risk management, specifically land transactions. So just ignore this here. Last week we talked about governance and finance. Today we're going to be talking about land transactions, but this is a partnership between the Land Trust Alliance and the Connecticut Land Conservation Council. We have, we're able to deliver this program because of the PCLB Foundation. So glad you're here. I think you all are on mute automatically. We're going to have time, just like we did in our earlier sessions. We're actually going to be breaking out for a little bit this evening. So you'll have a chance to come off mute. We'll have plenty of time for questions. So let's see, is there anything else? Feel free to rename yourself and add your organization to your name if you'd like, to help us know who you are. And then feel free to use the chat throughout Connie's presentation and the session in general. Let us know if you have any issues with Zoom. We are recording the session, so just also wanted to let you know that as well. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Connie.
Thanks, Jen. So obviously one of the risks in doing a series is that you might use the same slide and forget to change the title. So I had not caught that, and please do ignore the title of this as governance, because we are doing land transactions tonight. So just by way of introduction again, I don't think anyone's new. I'm Connie Manis. I serve as a consultant to the Land Trust Alliance, CLCC, and others, particularly in the areas of organizational capacity building and land trust accreditation. But I'm also an executive director at a land trust. And so from doing that work, I know really what the practical side of this looks like, not just what the consultants like me tell you to do. So thanks again for signing on this week for our Hour of Power, as I've started to think of it, tour through risk management. And I really hope that you'll find that your time invested in these activities pays off in terms of preventing downside risks, as well as preparing for risk activities that might lead to very positive outcomes. So we're going to spend a quick moment, as we did last week, with the risk management vocab, which I have to say becomes clearer each time that we meet. So let's just, by way of review, remember that we are defining risk as both the threat or the opportunity that a future event or action might end up different from what we expected, either adversely or beneficially impacting our mission. So any situation where the outcome is not a certainty involves a level of risk, and risk management is a discipline for addressing that uncertainty. So last week, we again learned that there are 3 dimensions to help quantify and analyze risk. The first is likelihood. A given outcome could be not at all likely, very likely, or fall somewhere in between. And that outcome could happen very rarely or infrequently, or frequently, or somewhere in between. The second dimension is magnitude, and that the impact of an outcome could be a small matter only, or it could really be life-changing for the organization. So, your risk threshold really relates to how comfortable you are with having all of your eggs in one basket, or, whether you can deal with these high magnitude risks, or you really want to apply something to help to offset that. And then the third dimension is direction, of course, and that an outcome could be good or it could be bad. And here once again is our rubric showing that the likelihood and the magnitude together help to guide our investment in actions to influence outcomes. So category A risks are the ones where we want to focus the most energy and resources. These are not just what ifs, they are high likelihood, high impact areas. We're going to want to take action here to influence the outcome by making it more or less likely, more or less impactful, and maybe also to offset some of the financial and reputational costs in the event that the outcome happens by using things like risk financing. Category B risks deserve focus due to their impact, but they might never come to pass. Here, it might make more sense to engage in some risk financing or risk displacement, so shifting the risk to another organization or somebody else's responsibility. Category C risks are highly likely, but not catastrophic. And here it makes sense to figure out what actions you can take on the organization's own behalf to deal with the impact or control the likelihood. And then finally, by suggesting that category D risks should be accepted, this rubric is saying it might be a distraction and a waste of resources to focus on these. Okay, so tonight's focus on land protection. Land protection is a common part, I would expect, of all of our missions, and a very critical one. We know that we collectively need to accelerate the pace of our land protection right now if we're going to make a dent in the impact of climate change. One big risk that I worry about is that we won't have the money or the capacity to do it. And Christopher, I saw your comment earlier in the chat that one of your risks is that there aren't enough people in your organization that know how to do this. So that is a worry of mine. And that's why I think it's so important to involve many people in the organization in the nuts and bolts of land protection. It's insufficient to have one person only who works on this and who knows the details and how to go about it. A land protection committee can help do this, as can a set process for identifying, developing, and seeing projects through, and also for documenting and sharing full information about the project with the board, so it has the ability to discuss and make an informed vote. The content in this session is going to again draw from standards and practices to help us frame and understand where the risks are and what to do about some of them. We'll look at 5 areas of risk, then break out for peer discussion and strategizing, leaving room once more for your questions at the end. Okay, so the most impactful conservation projects don't just fall from the sky into our laps. And sometimes projects are proposed that might be impractical, off mission, or saddle the organization with liability. Project selection is the first and critical step in ensuring the organization's projects, which bind the organization in perpetuity, are well considered smart choices. So a land trust that develops clear project selection criteria will have the ability to objectively look at a project to determine whether it's mission consistent, serves a public benefit, is feasible to complete, and whether the organization can fulfill the prospective stewardship needs of the project in perpetuity. Project selection criteria are typically broadly written to allow the organization to exercise discretion and make its analysis specific. Still, if a project doesn't fit the criteria, the organization has the ability to turn it down or to negotiate the terms in order to make it compatible. In this way, project selection criteria help avoid the risk of expending organizational resources in areas that don't serve the mission. On the flip side of having project selection criteria that are so narrowly written is the risk that you wouldn't make sufficient effort to protect the properties that matter most, right? So we want to make sure that we apply project selection criteria to the opportunities that come to us, but we also want to make sure that our project selection criteria drive us to pursue new opportunities that might not have been those ones that fell into our lap, right? We want to more aggressively pursue our conservation priorities. So project selection criteria go hand in hand with strategic mapping. With today's improved technology, we're able to analyze the areas within which we work to identify the parcels which most clearly fit our selection criteria. We can reach out to the landowners of those parcels, or we can organize neighborhood campaigns maybe to protect a property. Besides written criteria and strategic mapping, additional risk mitigation strategies that are connected with project selection include avoiding private annulment and private benefit. So we want to make sure that any conflicts are identified and managed, as well as making sure that adequate financial resources like an acquisitions reserve or other strike funding are available to employ when opportunities arise. All right, standard 9, once you've determined that you've got a project that fits your project selection criteria, the next step is to put together a thoroughly vetted, secure project that will deliver on the conservation purposes that you intended and last in perpetuity. So we're talking about sound transactions here, and that means that first and foremost, you have to make sure that your organization has competent legal representation for each project. Don't be tempted to save money by not hiring counsel. And really, if we want to make sure that we'll avoid after the fact issues, it's important really that the landowner is also well represented so that both parties clearly understand the project's impact and its terms. An absolutely critical element of due diligence is title investigation. This aspect of putting together a deal should be one of your first steps each and every time. Title work early on helps assure that number one, you're working with the legal owner, and number two, that there are no clouds on title that could impact your deal. What does that mean? Well, in the context of a conservation easement, we know that property that's subject to a mortgage cannot be legally eased unless that mortgage is formally subordinated by the bank to the easement, so that the easement won't be undone even if the bank must foreclose on that mortgage. There are other title issues that can impact our deals. Rights of way over the land that we're trying to protect, rights to draw water from that land, lack of legal access to the land, use restrictions, or sometimes quirky covenants can impact the way that we foresee our protection going. Driveway agreements is another one that typically comes up. Sometimes homeowners association agreements if you're protecting land that is part of a subdivision plan. The list goes on. And you, as members of a board or staff of the organization, should be reviewing the title documentation for yourselves, as well as having your attorney look, because you know best the intended conservation purposes of the project. So your attorney might not be looking for the same things that you are. If you're buying the property, you should absolutely purchase title insurance. Even if you've not invested substantial sums, consider at least a nominal amount of title insurance to provide recourse in the event of a title claim. For easements in Connecticut, I have often seen, rather than title insurance, the landowner's attorney or even the land trust attorney providing a certificate of insurance, which provides some recourse in the case of a title claim later on. Title work should always be updated just prior to closing, particularly if some time has passed, as often does, since the inception of due diligence. And sometimes this is referred to as a bring down. It should always be done the day of closing, just to make sure there hasn't been anything placed on title in the interim. Environmental review can include some of the things you'll encounter in title review, but it really starts with your site visit, your examination of maps, and a consideration of what's happened on that property and around the property in the past. Knowledge of what's happened there will help drive the level of environmental review you obtain. So some properties might not need much more than a thorough ground inspection and a historical screen, but others, for instance, if the property has existing structures or was used for an industrial purpose, they might warrant professional examination and testing. If your organization is purchasing property or an easement, or in the case of a bargain sale, it's best practice to obtain an independent appraisal on which to base the purchase price. You don't want to pay more than fair market value. And this, of course, would convey a private benefit, potentially violating nonprofit law. So really make sure that you know how much the property is worth, and then start your negotiations on your purchase price. Your legal documents are worthy of particular focus, especially your easements. If there are terms you're negotiating, make sure that your counsel understands what your organization intends and how words and clauses have been interpreted in this area of practice. Be on the alert for things that will be difficult to monitor and enforce. CLCC's model easement is updated regularly in response to federal and state case law and industry developments. It is purposely broad to allow general applicability. However, the model also provides excellent examples of specific clauses so that each easement can be individually negotiated to best protect that particular property. And then finally, for this slide, is the consideration of how you will know and defend property boundaries. Most land trusts now require that there be a recent and reliable survey of the property with physical monumentation that can be found when on site. This level of certainty is very important for marking boundaries and for both parties, easy appreciation of where those boundaries are. Okay, this next slide is part of developing sound transactions, but as you may know, the land trust standards and practices take federal tax matters separately in Standard 10. The continued good reputation of land conservation and our ability to use tools like conservation easements depends on ferreting out those who would abuse tax law by claiming charitable deductions to which they're not entitled. We also know that the IRS applies extra scrutiny to conservation easement-based tax claims, and no one wants their donor to be audited or to have a hard time as a result of their generosity to conservation. So therefore, when we're working with a donor who might take a charitable deduction, in order to head off risks to us, to our donors, it makes sense to be early and clear that there are tax regulations and that certain things will be needed for the donor's tax returns, that their choice of appraiser, the contents of the appraisal, the specific language of the appraisal, and the timing of the appraisal all matter. It also makes sense to make sure we're doing our part to examine the landowner's appraisal in the Form 8283 before we sign it for completeness and consistency with the value being claimed. Finally, and without going down the rabbit hole too much, although we can in questions if there are any, are you aware and ready with the resources that you need in the event you're approached by somebody representing a syndicated group, which is basically a large group of unrelated investors who own the property proposed to be conserved? Do you know about the Land Trust Alliance's resources on this topic? And do you know who you would reach out to for help to make sure that you follow the rules if you're going to consider a transaction like this? I haven't seen too much of this in Connecticut, I have to say, which is a good thing, knocking on wood here. But it's important to know it so that you recognize it when it comes to you. All right, when considering the project, and definitely before closing, it makes sense to think about prospective stewardship responsibilities. Knowing what you might need to do helps you consider what you might need to spend. So for both easements and fee properties, there might be initial startup one-time expenses. I've listed some of them here for you to consider, and there will always be future expenses for monitoring, for management, and for dealing with issues of enforcement or issues that need additional management. We could really spend a whole hour on preparing baseline documentation reports for easements. They're really important to the future stewardship of conservation easements, and they must be done carefully and professionally with formalities, including signatures and notaries. You will be doing better risk management if you engage an experienced professional to prepare these, somebody whose credentials will hold up to cross-examination in the event of litigation. So get yourself somebody who prepares DDRs for a fee. It's worth it. Some properties present with higher risk that significant expenditures might be needed. Properties bordering a planned subdivision, for example, or with significant reserve rights, those would be easements, with hard to establish boundaries, or an attractive nuisance, like something on a fee property that just keeps drawing the local kids because they love to hang out there, right? Some properties are simply more expensive to steward than others. Think about monitoring a 900-acre property as opposed to monitoring a 9-acre property. Being prepared to assume perpetual stewardship obligations might mean setting aside considerable reserves to ensure the organization's forever ability to meet the obligations. And the time to be thinking about these things is when you're putting the deal together, not after the fact. Conservation is not done when the papers are signed, right? It only begins there. So what we do upon closing and what we do afterwards is just as important to risk management as the components of project selection and sound transaction planning. Recording your transaction in the appropriate town land records office puts all on notice that you hold the property interest, and it prevents anyone else from causing a title issue before you can record. So get there quickly. By quickly, usually I would say that day, but certainly, within 3 to 5 days. Okay, let's talk for a moment about record keeping, which is the backbone of your risk management where your conservation projects are concerned. To be secure that our properties are well protected, we need to be able to defend them. Being able to prove in a court of law that your organization in fact holds the interest it says it does requires the evidence of recorded deeds or easements. Proving that we've upheld our responsibilities and not been negligent in watching the property requires the evidence of monitoring reports. Proving our claim against an encroacher, that might require evidence of before and after the encroachment, what the property looked like, right? So we know that we're not just planning for now. We're not just record keeping for the documents that we're going to retrieve next year. We're record keeping for the board that's going to be holding these properties 100 years from now, when nobody remembers what we did, right? So record keeping is really the crux. And never mind the hypothetical court case. In order to best steward our properties, it's essential that we can easily lay our hands on documents that help us know the property and its history, including what's happened on it ever since we protected it. We need our records to be, number 1, findable, 2, complete, and 3, credible. And to best assure this, we need a written record-keeping policy, and we need a process for record keeping. For property documents, the Land Trust Alliance has the concept of irreplaceable documents. Those are the documents that you'd need for that hypothetical court case. It used to be that we talked about having a set of originals, but in this digital age, I prefer the term record set because it's no longer necessary to have a pen and ink signature so long as you can prove the authenticity of a document. So a digital document will do, but think about protection of that record set. How are you going to protect your documents from loss, alteration, from theft, from destruction, from inadvertent misplacement? If they're on paper, you want a locked file cabinet, and a flood-proof file cabinet, or an area that isn't going to be, where the documents aren't going to be damaged. If they're digital, you want to make sure that they're in an archived format that can't be changed. Consider a folder that has some limitations on access and protections against alteration or deletion. Have a backup to the record set that you store in a different place, just in case, and make sure that it's clear how and who is responsible for maintaining the records and ensuring that new documentation that gets created, like monitoring reports, gets added to that set. Okay, I want to do a time check here. Good, we're right on time. Just to break things up, we thought we'd do some breakout discussions this week. And I think that we have maybe about 12 minutes or so. I don't know, 12 to 15 minutes, Rebecca. And we are hoping that during your breakouts, you will tackle these 2 questions. What do you think is your organization's biggest risk related to land transactions? And number 2, hopefully, some of the silver lining, what is a strategy you currently use or that you will use to address this risk? When we come back from the breakout sessions, we'll take some time to report out, and then we'll have time for Q&A. I hope that you enjoy these questions. We really have so much to learn from each other's experience and expertise. I think knowing your peers and knowing that there's somebody other than the consultant to reach out to is one of Connecticut's biggest assets in this work. So I hope you have fun. Have a good time. See you in 12 or 13 minutes.
And for anyone who hasn't been in a breakout room before, I just hit open all the rooms. You'll get a prompt on your screen that will say what room number you're joining, and then you can click join, and you'll be zapped over to that room in cyberspace, and then we'll zap you back. So we'll see you soon.
That we could
And I think
we could do.
stop sharing the screen so that we can have the Q&A and report outs looking at each other. Is everyone back?
Looks like everyone's back.
All right. Well, I hope that you guys had an enjoyable time talking to each other and identifying some of the risks that you are experiencing now in your organizations. And I hope that some of you considered good risks as well as bad risks. Would anyone like to, to talk a little bit about what, what they covered in their breakout room? I think we can, it's helpful to all see each other, but maybe if you would put your hand up using the reactions, then we can call on you in turn. Does anyone want to be first to share what they talked about? Yeah, Lee.
Hey, whoops, unmute myself. The unfortunate individuals in my room got to hear my weekly confession of all the things that we're not doing and all the problems that we have, and it was very nice to share that and get it off my chest and out into the open, and some good suggestions on things we might want to look at. But I think for my personal view on things is really of where do we start, and as far as addressing risk, it's quite basic. That's the reason I'm here tonight, to try to understand what the risks are and identify some of these A-level risks that we need to jump on, so that I can work with our board to number one, get them to understand that we've got to do something, and then two, to actually do that thing.
So can you just put a name? Were you able to get specific about one risk and then one strategy to help to manage that?
One risk. No, not really. We didn't go into any, I don't believe any specific risk, although I may have been focused in another direction. I don't know, Rick, or the woman's name who was on it with us from Groton. If you have anything you'd like to add, I didn't mean to designate myself as the spokesperson here.
All right. Anyone want to share? What was it? Was it your records? Was it lack of surveys? Insufficient stewardship funding? Was it?
We talked about mainly resource issues and things with record keeping and paperwork and things like that. And we also talked a little bit about mergers, which might alleviate some of the problems with the resource issues.
So records-wise, what are you going to do about that? Or what would you, in a perfect world?
Well, what we've the first thing we're doing is we are considering hiring a part-time administrative assistant to sort all this out, get our records organized, find out what we do and don't have. As unbelievable as it might sound to many of the folks here, my current position with Wolf Den is president of the board. I have no idea what's in our records. Okay, that's not right. That's not good. That needs to change. We need to get our records organized, figure out where we're deficient, what we do have, what we don't have, get them someplace safe, and make them useful. Okay, that's, to me, is pretty clear. Step one. Okay, once we get through step one, then maybe we can decide where to go from there.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. A records audit would be a really good first step. And I have found, just so you know, that it takes a couple of times through the files, usually before you get them just the way that you want. What about another room? What did somebody in one of the other rooms talk about? Anyone?
We talked about, we started, Mike and Margot, our volunteer organizations. So again, the records issues came in there. They're not accredited, so they don't have their processes and stuff down. Steve Brock's on the other end of the spectrum. Our organization has been around almost in perpetuity, and we're just finishing up our reaccreditation now. And two areas of risk that we've identified that we haven't done a good job on is encumbrances, dealing with the encumbrances, especially at the end of the process when you're about to close. And also taking a closer look at internal transactions. So financial conflicts of interest, or even land conflicts of interest with board trustees or committee members. I mean, we're in a really small town, so everybody multitasks and doubles and triples up. And so, one of our trustees also happened to be our landlord for 12 years. So we got to be careful about fair market value and being at or below fair market value. And I think from our standpoint, we could have documented things a little bit better. But if we'd known 5 years ago what we know now, we would have. So
sounds like an educational management strategy, right, Brian? It's nobody wanted to not deal with the encumbrances, but you weren't really sure what it was that you were supposed to be doing, and now you know better. Right. So starting with some education around how to spot those things out, and deeper discussions among your board about what those mean, right?
It even goes to things like acknowledgement letters. So we've created basically a project checklist from that first interaction with a landowner who wants to donate land all the way through to closing and post-closing. And so that we can use the checklist to remind ourselves and make sure things are checked off as we go along. And then that can also be bequeathed when we go through staff changes or even board chair changes, that at least this checklist exists and we know what we've done and what we have to do.
Yeah. Great. Anyone else?
This is Christopher. I'll go for our group. I think some similar themes. Our risks weren't so much around, we've run into problems doing a title search or something like that. We've had the resources or found pro bono resources to have some professional help. But it's often been more around these organizational capacity concerns, that turnover. The one board member who's handled most of these for a decade, what if when they go, how much of this is well done? The process, some of the paperwork is documented. We've had things scanned, we've backed up files, but it's more that institutional knowledge about some of that process stuff. There's, only one or two people that have been involved in most of the nitty gritty details of most of the land transactions. It's not a large committee. There's not a broad based shared understanding amongst the entire board. I would argue actually many of our board members couldn't point to where all of our properties are on maps, and necessarily, because we have a bunch of random miscellaneous ones. Beth from Insonia and I'm losing them. This is Stephen. We were talking a little bit also just some of the historical things. So some properties or some transactions that were from many years ago, when we know things were done a little less formally. And so kind of like, do we dare try to go into that paperwork and look to see were things done as properly then as we would do them now? Do we have a problem there? Or if there's no current transaction happening with that property, do we leave well enough alone? And some of those same things around protecting of the documents and when there's turnover, whether it's staff or volunteers. So some of the same general organizational capacity issues as opposed to explicitly land transaction issues.
Yeah. And I would say that in terms of your, what you don't know, do you just let the files lie or peek into them? That it can be effective to use a bit of a triage and think about the properties that would be most impactful if, you were to lose them or have something significant happen. So I just want to, before we move to straight out questions, I just want to note that Priscilla had her hand up, I think, and as did the gentleman from Hamden. And so maybe we'll take those two questions or those two report outs, if you will, and then move on from there. So Priscilla, do you want to go?
My only comment was going to be that for us, for Flanders, the accreditation process 5 years ago made us get our act together, line up our ducks and go through. Now, there's still a lot of work we have to do. There's still record keeping we have to straighten out, but it really opened our eyes to what was amiss and what we needed to do and headed us in the right direction of correcting all of that. That's my only comment.
Thank you. And I'm sorry that I don't have your name today.
It's Tim. And so some of the things we talked about are lack of surveys. So what do you do in those cases? Small, some land trusts, can't afford to have expensive surveys done, especially if they have multiple properties. And, and I understand that's, important to get for the accreditation. And so I'm fairly new to the land trust, 3 years now, and I'm on the stewardship committee, just trying to learn all I can. And I'm not really sure about this accreditation process. And another point that we talked about was unforeseen hazards on the property once you own them. You discover an open well or a dangerous building, or like some small structure or something that wasn't seen before. And I was reading in I guess it was a Connecticut statute that you could be held liable if you didn't post of a danger on the property. But then there's the thought, well, if you post that there's a danger, you should probably have taken care of it. So these are just some of the things that we were talking about.
Well, that's a place where, preparation, the more investigation and site examination that you do up front, the more you're going to know, in terms of what you're going to need to really take care of that property and protect your organization. And I would say the same about surveys. I mean, ideally, if you ever had a boundary dispute, you're going to need to get a survey, right? So like if you're living without a survey now, maybe you're getting by with your monitoring, but if there ever really were an issue, you'd eventually end up getting a survey in order to, take your case to court or to be able to negotiate with the landowner. You would need to know with certainty what the boundaries were. So, again, it's a question of triage. You might be able to piece together surveys from adjoining properties that would at least give you some certainty of what the lines are. But make a list of the properties you don't have surveys for, and over time, knock them off. I understand resources are scarce, but I think that we really shouldn't try to skimp too much on things that create an obligation, a financial obligation on us for the rest of forever. So it probably makes sense to do it the right way rather than saddle the board of your future with some problems that they aren't going to be able to withstand. Okay, we have maybe 2 more minutes and then we just have to move through some final slides. So Beth, you had a question?
Well, it's also a comment, and just with our breakout with Chris, what would your answer be if someone asked you, what is the best way to make sure that your land trust is around X number of years from now, or in perpetuity like our properties are? What would your answer be? Connie?
Financial reserves and accreditation.
Thank you.
That would be my answer.
Thank you. So we're a very small land trust and we are not accredited. And I've been, dragging on the shirt tails. I'm the executive director. I was a former trustee. I'm really delighted that Christian Brockman, who's on our governance committee, is on, because I know we have a not a dissimilar view, and it's very painful to become accredited, but it doesn't matter what your size is. And for us and our little hamlet of Darien, Connecticut, where every acre is precious, that's the best way. And I'm very concerned about how buttoned up or not we are. Similar to what Christopher was sharing, we have a few key individuals that were involved, very capable, outstanding, brilliant people. But again, if everyone got hit by a bus, it's concerning how buttoned up some of those really, really old agreements are. We have nothing scanned. Everything's in physical files. It's not prior proof. And I know we're not the only land trust. So anyway, yeah.
Well, there are lots of good places for you to start, sounds like, right? It seems like some of the things that you'd like to do that would be good risk management steps. And so, what are you waiting for?
Yeah. I'd like you to speak at one of our meetings.
Well, if I could piggyback on that very super briefly, I know Rebecca posted a link to the accreditation standards in the chat, but for our organization, I'll speak to, for any small organization, because we're a good example of this, where we haven't pursued accreditation either, but we did work with a consultant a few years ago who did an organizational assessment against those standards and kind of gave us that checklist of, here are things that you could work on. If you were going to pursue accreditation, here are the things you would have to work on. And while we chose not to pursue accreditation, we have continued to rely on that assessment. And periodically, depending on the capacity of the board, and sometimes we've just had some folks who are particularly interested in some of those issues, we've continued to kind of go back to that and pick off a couple more items every year and say, let's work on this year. Let's develop this policy this year. Let's go take care of getting our documents scanned. So it's just given us a good, valuable resource, even if we don't ever quite get to investing enough to actually become accredited. It's still been really helpful for the organization. So I'd say even for small land trusts who look at that and go, it's way too intimidating, we couldn't possibly do that, talk to CLCC, ask for suggestions for consultants who could still perhaps help do that organizational assessment process. And then you pick and choose based on what you are able to tackle.
Great. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about a bit of a different way to do that. And that is just, we wanted to spend just a quick minute debuting what happens after this series. So I'm going to pass the floor to Jen at this point.
Thanks,
Jen,
Connie.
just tell me when to advance.
Okay, thank you. So we mentioned this in the information session before we started the series, but for those of you who didn't join that, there will be an opportunity to apply for consultant support to do an organizational risk assessment with Connie. The applications are going to be opening just after we finish putting together the landing page, really, and posting it on CLCC's website. So within the next couple of days, you'll be able to apply for that opportunity. And I'm going to ask Rebecca, can you post the link to the Google form in the chat, please? So the application will be open to any land trust that's participated in these training sessions. And we will be asking that 3 people join Connie through this process. You'll get 10 hours of time meeting with her, both in advance of an organizational assessment being put together, and then 2 hours after that. So you have 8 hours and then, Connie will provide you with an assessment, and then you have 2 hours after that assessment to talk about what you want to do to implement some of the priorities that Connie has outlined in that plan. So it's over $1,500 worth of consultant support, and we're able, thank you to the PCLB Foundation, we're able to offer it at a reduced rate of $300 per member land trust or $500 for a non-member land trust. So next slide, Connie, please. So like I said, the applications will be open in the next couple of days. They'll be due at the end of the month, and then we'll let you know if you have been selected middle of next month. We have about 5 spots, but that's a little bit flexible. So if you're interested in this step, I would highly encourage you to apply. We'll be getting started with the assessments the middle of January and finalizing them in March. So it's right around the corner. Next slide, please. And I wanted to give folks a sense of what some of the questions are. Some of them are related to, your organization, if you are all volunteer or staffed, how many members are on the board of directors. We're going to be confirming whether you participated in the training, because these are really important building blocks that Connie, is giving to us through these trainings. We'll ask you to provide information about your assessment team, who's going to be working, at your organization to meet with Connie, etc. And then, just confirming that you're prepared to begin the work in January and that you have a commitment to continuing this work. We don't want it to sit on the shelf, and so we're really interested in hearing what you're hoping to get out of it and how you'll use that going forward. Do we have another slide, Connie, or is that it?
Yeah, we had just this resources slide that I referred to earlier, and here this is a slide, by the way, that it contains hyperlinks to materials that are provided by the Alliance to Alliance members. So I don't want to frustrate you if you are not a member and don't have access through these hyperlinks. But what I really wanted to illustrate here is that you can see that the Alliance has specific practices, specific resources that really go into great detail on all of these subjects. And, in a way that there's no way that I could ever do within an hour. And so if you do want to dive down more deeply into some of these subjects, the Alliance is a great resource for learning about these things. I know, because I did that. So that's the resource slide. And just fast forwarding to next Monday, we'll be taking a look at stewardship. And as part of stewardship, but also its own thing, in many cases, we're going to look at programming and risks associated with public programs. And then finally, a call out once more to send your questions ahead of time if you know that you have them, if you know there are things that that you definitely hope that we'll cover. I think that's about it. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see your faces. And once again, thank you for joining us tonight. It was a really good discussion. And I think that even though this stuff is kind of scary, that maybe we can draw comfort in knowing that there are commonalities, that we face similar challenges, and that we've found that there are ways that we can address these things that will make us feel a little bit more secure. So I'm glad you got to know your peers in that way. Happy to talk to you about this. And thanks very much again for coming. We'll see you next week.